Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Ken Blaker and Cuong Do. Ken is a healthcare and technology consultant. Cuong is a healthcare executive. He's the CEO of BioV, and together we're going to talk about the KevinMD article, Rising Longevity and Cognitive Health, Navigating Dementia and Treatment. Ken and Cuong, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin, for having us.
So I'm going to ask each of you just to briefly share your story and journey, then we'll talk about the article. Ken, why don't you go first?
So maybe I'll put them together, and I'll start with my own experience of Alzheimer's, of dealing with Alzheimer's. I had an uncle who was a very prominent orthopedic surgeon in Philadelphia. People may still remember him, Marty Blaker, and he was an incredible intellect. And at the end of his life, what I saw was that he descended into dementia. I remember sitting with him and him suddenly grabbing my arm and saying, "How do I know you?" And this is somebody who could, a few years earlier, recite passages of books that he'd read 30 years before. At the end, it not only debilitated him, I think sadly what affected me most was that it left him prey to some really unscrupulous people who abused his estate. And it was a terrible thing to see. It's a terrible affliction. His specific dimension was Alzheimer's, and it gave me a great interest in the subject. I've also written over the years a number of things about healthcare.
What generated the article this summer was the approval of Leqembi with full FDA approval, which is certainly a good thing, but it's a drug which attacks the protein plaques in the brain. And it's a fairly aggressive action within the brain. There's a lot of side effects to it. And what struck me is that it's not by any means a cure or a reversal or even a stop of the progress of the Alzheimer's. So when you go to the literature, what I see is a distinct relationship between Alzheimer's and neuroinflammation. This has been established for over 30 years. And so the article was really about the fact that there's a better way to go than aggressively going into the brain and trying to clear up these plaques, when the better method perhaps and hopefully will be to clear up the source of those plaques, the cause of them. That gets into the science, which is why I invited Cuong to also join, because he certainly can talk to the science of that much better than I can.
All right. So before we get into that, Cuong, just briefly share your story and journey.
Kevin, thanks again for having me. My background is in the biochemist by training, 17 years at consulting for McKinsey & Company, where I helped build the healthcare practice there. Since then, I've been a serial chief strategy officer for large companies, including Merck and all of Samsung. I've been involved with BioV for a very long time. I've been on the board of the company for shepherding through a program in liver disease. Then about 3 years ago, I orchestrated BioV's acquisition of an asset that I was convinced could become the first truly effective drug for Alzheimer's disease. And the last condition for the deal from my own board, as well as the seller, is that if I wanted to do this deal, I had to step in as the CEO to oversee the development of the portfolio, because I was the one that had the greatest conviction and that really understood what was going on. And at this point in time, I just retired from Samsung. I had a little bit more time in my hand. So I really had no choice but to kind of go and step into this role. And I believe in this molecule. I believe it so much I took all of my compensation in equity instead of cash.
So Cuong, tell us a little bit about this approach to Alzheimer's, just for those who may not have that medical background. What made you so convinced that this had the biggest promise?
Yep. But the medical community has known that Alzheimer's has an inflammatory component for many decades. But frankly, no one has been able to figure out how to address it. Right? Some people try to use just different NSAIDs to see if that would work. Of course, that doesn't. People have tried to use anti-TNF monoclonal like Enbrel and so forth, but that has its complications. It can never cross the blood-brain barrier. And so people kind of gave up on inflammation as being undruggable. Right? And that's why a lot of work has been done on the amyloids, right? Frankly, when I started working in Alzheimer's back in the late 80s, it was all focused on the amyloids. Whereas I truly believe that chronic low-grade inflammation is the root of many bad things that start to go wrong in the body. So when you have the presence of TNF-alpha, it actually triggers insulin resistance. It leads to the production of additional inflammatory cytokines and chemokines, which can create additional inflammation. TNF-alpha drives the production of the amyloid precursor protein, so it gives you more amyloid, right? And it also is responsible for driving the kinase that phosphorylates tau into phospho-tau, right? So TNF-alpha is, in my mind, the starting point, the crux, the hub of many things involving Alzheimer's disease.
So how far are we from the product? Or where are we in the research cycle when it comes to this approach?
Well, I hope to have much better news for the community later on this year. Our drug candidate, NE3107, is a very unique molecule. It's an oral drug that patients take twice a day. It freely crosses into the blood-brain barrier, so it gets into the CNS where it does its work. And we are completing our phase 3 clinical trial right now. The last patient has already came in for his or her last visit. So we are now in the process of cleaning the data, getting everything ready in the database so that we can lock the database and start to analyze the data and unblind. And we hope to have unblinding and reveal of the top line data sometime after Thanksgiving of this year, right? So if this turns out to be a positive trial, namely if we have an impact on cognition and if we're able to reduce amyloid beta, well, frankly, that's how Leqembi was approved, right? That's how aducanumab was approved, right? And so that may give us an opportunity to go and have a conversation with the FDA next year around the same accelerated approval while we conduct our confirmatory or second phase 3. Is that likely to happen? I don't know. I probably give that about 25% probability that we can get accelerated approval, because remember, this mechanism is different. It reduces inflammation. It doesn't attack the amyloid directly. So the jury is out on whether or not we will see a reduction of A beta later on this year. Mechanistically, we should expect to see some. How much? We have to wait and see.
So Ken, when you were telling us that story about your experiences and what you saw with the decline of someone with Alzheimer's, in general, what kind of treatment options are currently available to patients in case studies like these?
What I'm aware of is certainly the drugs like Leqembi, which do remove some plaque and slow down the disease. And most of the other treatments that I'm seeing that I'm aware of, and certainly what was used with my uncle, was cognitive enhancement techniques or drugs that would help with that have an effect on improving memory per se. But of course, none of them actually reverse the disease. What they hopefully do is slow the decline. They're recommended for anybody with early signs of memory loss as we age. It's a common thing, but why is it a common thing is the other question. Why does the body age as the body ages? And certainly one of the effects that we see along with loss of elasticity in other parts of the body, we see a decline in the brain.
And Ken, as your uncle was going through these more classical traditional treatments, did it have an appreciable improvement in his symptoms?
Not that I saw. No, I didn't see improvement, and I'm not really in a position to have gauged if it slowed his decline, because the question is how quickly would he have declined if he hadn't had those treatments being administered or those exercises.
Now, tell us something about Cuong's approach to Alzheimer's, his story that specifically resonates with you.
I think the fact that it's going early into the cycle of the development of the disease, that rather than treating the symptom, it's attacking closer to the cause. And that resonates with me because I think it's an inherent problem we have in medicine, that we don't know a patient has a problem until they have it. So medicine has often backfilled on treating symptoms and not always getting to the cause. It's hard to get to the cause. It's certainly the goal of everybody in medicine and it's in medical science, but it's a very difficult process. And again, when the patient finally comes in with whatever illness, the symptoms are the initial focus.
I think partly what happened is that the medical community really got enamored with single pathway treatments, right? Because around this time, if as you may recall, we really started to conquer cardiovascular disease, right? And in cardiovascular, you can pinpoint a single pathway. If you essentially want to tackle hypertension, block ACE. It's very simple. If you want to tackle cholesterol, very simple. Block HMG-CoA reductase, which gives us the statins. So I think we brought that same mindset over to the research of Alzheimer's, thinking that there is a single pathway, there's a magic bullet that can be used. And Alzheimer's and many CNS diseases are far, far too complicated than that, right? And I think the reality, if you look at dementia pathology, we first focused on A beta because that's the first thing that we saw that was beginning to have some degree of effect. And then we started looking at tau. But then over the decades of working in this area, there's not been a single drug discovered that can reduce the plaques and the tangles and that we're able to reverse the cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. And within the last decade or so, I think the community has gotten more accustomed to the notion that plaques and tangles themselves may not be the toxic agent that's causing the cognitive decline, but in fact, they are inflammatory in nature. They contribute to the inflammation that's going on. But the reality is many other things contribute to inflammation, right? And that's why I believe, if you look at the monoclonals that reduce the plaque buildup, you only see a slowing of the cognitive decline because in reality, all you've done is you've reduced the inflammation that's caused by the amyloid plaques, but you haven't done anything about the inflammation that's driven by the other factors. And that's why I believe our drug candidate, NE3107, has the potential to be very different because we block inflammation at the central node. Right? I say that because all of these inflammatory stimuli that's out there rely on one common characteristic. They activate something called ERK, which is the extracellular regulated kinase, which in turn activates NF-kappa B, the nuclear factor kappa B. And you need those two to be activated to produce TNF-alpha. Right? And that's where NE3107 works. It blocks the activation of ERK and NF-kappa B, and therefore blocks TNF-alpha. So for us, we don't care where the inflammatory stimuli came from. We block them all at the central node.
So, of course, we're talking about NE3107. Over the last few years, there's been several advances when it comes to Alzheimer's treatment. There's Leqembi, there's aducanumab. Just, Cuong, give us your perspective in terms of what we have to look for going forward when it comes to Alzheimer's treatment.
I think Leqembi really gave the community a hope, right? So the first ray of hope in a long time, because up until Leqembi was approved, patients were just continuing on the decline, right? And Leqembi is one step forward in slowing the decline. And I'll let the clinicians figure it out for which patients can really benefit from it, which ones cannot. But at least it's a tool out there. And I think that going forward, the community will see that we will need to treat Alzheimer's the same way that we treat oncology, right? Mm-hmm. No one would ever think of treating a cancer patient with a single drug nowadays. It's always a combination, right? And Leqembi is the first such drug, and I think additional drugs will come to the market, right? And I think 3107 could be the first of a completely new class of molecules that instead of trying to remove the plaques and tangles that have accumulated in the brain, it tries to prevent the inflammation, which adds to the plaques and tangles to begin with, right? So I believe that as we saw in our phase 2 trial, patients in a very short period of time saw a reversal of their cognitive decline, not a slowing, a reversing of the cognitive decline. And we believe what the reason that's the case is that we reduce the inflammation, we reduce all the downstream knockdown consequences of that inflammation, right? And by doing so, we allow the body to kind of help restore itself. We allow microglia cells to help clear the accumulated plaques and tangles. And we essentially restore neuronal health. We improve neuronal health because we increase oxygen availability in the brain. We increase glucose availability in the brain. Okay? With that, it just kind of helps neurons to be healthier.
We're talking to Ken Blaker and Cuong Do. Ken is a healthcare and technology consultant. Cuong is the CEO of BioV, and together we've been talking about the KevinMD article, Rising Longevity and Cognitive Health, Navigating Dementia and Treatment. I'm going to ask each of you just to share some take-home messages to the KevinMD audience. Ken, why don't you go first?
Dr. Alzheimer first published his work on the disease almost 120 years ago. And I think we finally, in the last 30 years, have started to understand the mechanisms of inflammation within the brain that have led to Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. And I think that this is a time of great hope. And Cuong's laid out the science very well. It's the idea that this is a reversible disease is certainly something possible today, and it wasn't until very, very recently.
Cuong, and we'll end off with your take-home messages to the KevinMD audience.
I think the critical thing to take away from this conversation is that there's alternative mechanisms at play in the treatment of Alzheimer's. We have all been focused on the amyloid plaque hypothesis because that's been the furthest along, it's the most research, and it now has led to a drug like Leqembi, which gives us hope. But we hope to show later on this year, when the top-line data for NE3107 reads out, that by focusing on this ultimate driving factor in my mind, which is inflammation, by reducing inflammation, we hope to have an impact on cognition as well. And if we're able to show that, I think we now will open up a second front on this war on what is a terrible, terrible disease that affects 6 million Americans and well over 50 million people worldwide.
Well, thank you both for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having us.